Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Well, happy days are here again. And this is Half the Answer, where understanding a question is half the answer. I'm going to keep saying happy days are here again because now I'm like trauma bonded to it. So it's like, it's my insecure attachment comfort animal at this point.
Sure.
So that's where we're at. So I am your co-host, Caitlin Green. With me is Trent Nelson, and I have come to understand that Trent has brought me a particularly special guest today, someone I'm very excited about. Who you got, Trent?
Absolutely. The happy days are here again. Will continue until morale improves. That's the ticket. I
just understand that every time I say it, I'm seeing that little clown doll from my childhood that played it, that its torso rotated in an upsetting way. That's right in here every time.
You know what? We both got inspired by that song in different ways. Caitlin, we have absolutely brilliance today on the show. Brilliance personified. We have a great friend of the show. We're looking forward to having her back. It's only her first time here. Her name is Andrea Pitzer. Andrea Pitzer, and she is an author, she's a writer, she's a podcaster, she's a mom, she's a black belter, and if you run into a polar bear, well, she'll be the one you want to hang out with, all right, because she's licensed to handle those in rough situations as well. But to be fair and honest, all joking aside, we're here to discuss a very difficult topic today, Caitlin. We're here to discuss... It's
not polar bears?
It is not polar bear, self-defense. You know what? Let's leave the polar bears alone. Don't they have enough to worry about? We're here to talk about detention centers, which we should rightfully call concentration camps. And we briefly touched upon this discussion when we had Jonathan Mariah Katz on the program last time. We also, I believe, touched it briefly when we spoke with Gillian last time. It's really important stuff. Andrea, thank you so much for finding some time to come on and talk with us. We know that you are in high demand. Such a pleasure, of course, even with terrible times. Can you give us a bit about yourself, more than I gave with my bio, and then we need to just jump in and ask, how did we get here? And I suspect that that'll take some history as well, and then we'll get to exactly what's going on right now and how to stop it.
So, well, first, thanks for having me on. Great to be a first-time guest and already be invited back. That's pretty awesome. I feel like, I can't lose from here. And so in terms of who I am, I'm a journalist. I've written for a lot of different publications, for The Atlantic, New York Review of Books, LA Review of Books, New York Magazine, Outside, bunches of places. And I've written 3 books. I am here talking with you today because of the second of those 3 books, which is called One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. And it looks at the rise of concentration camps in the world. Sort of the question I wanted to answer was, how did humanity get to Auschwitz? And what happened to this idea of concentration camps afterward? And I was really singularly unqualified to write the book, to be honest. I was working on my first book, which was about Vladimir Nabokov, the Russian-American novelist. And camps came up again and again and again in his life and in his works that he actually mentioned. And it was a variety of camps. So World War I internment, the Gulag, Nazi camps. I went to Neuengamme, which is a concentration camp memorial in northern Germany, which was where his brother had died. And I spent some time there. And while I was working on that book, I thought, I need to read like a general history of these camps. When did this idea of rounding up civilians as a group kind of preemptively without criminal charges and no real trials or due process, when did this come into the world? Like, how did we start this? And it didn't exist. And so then I decided, okay, it has to be written. Now I went to Georgetown University, School of Foreign Service. So writing, international affairs, politics, history. I mean, maybe I wasn't the most unqualified person to write that book, but I was not a camp specialist. I met people who had spent 30 years studying one camp, but there was no book that actually did the broad panoramic view of it. And I thought it was so essential, I wanted to write it. And so I should be clear, these are modern concentration camps that I'm writing about. And I make that clear because there is a real heritage of this kind of detention that we have to nod to, because concentration camps can't enter the world without some of that previous stuff. And the most important parts of that history of locking up groups of civilians without any due process or trial, we have to look at the Americas, Africa, Asia. It's a lot of colonial powers and imperialism doing kind of early versions of this, particularly in the Americas under Spanish rule, and then under British and then later American rule with Native American genocide, removals. You do see a lot of things that look very much like modern camps. But this early thing that happens in the at the end of that period, the beginning of modern concentration camp history, is you have the invention, patenting, and mass production of barbed wire and automatic weapons. So suddenly you can hold a ton of people with a really small guard force. So the 1890s are when you have this birth of this stuff, where you have these camps framed by barbed wire, where you're rounding people up, and it becomes part of an engineering logistics thing of just literally how many people could we get. So I looked at that on 6 continents across 130 years. There is no political system. There is no continent that hasn't done it except for the Antarctic. And so basically what I found was that it is always an end run around the existing legal system. So whatever legal system is in place, and some of them we would have found really terrible, right? If we look back at history, these were not necessarily democracies. These were not necessarily good legal systems. They were sometimes very punitive. But setting up these kinds of camps is an end run, something you can't quite do under whatever the law is there at the time. So it's a grab for power, to entrench power or to expand power on the part of a political, usually authoritarian style leader or party. And it is always done starting with vulnerable groups in that society. And from the beginning, so from the 1890s forward, I found that it was, as soon as there was a second camp setting to compare the first one to, people were already saying, no, 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 our camps aren't like those camps. These people are really dangerous. And I say that not just to like make a joke. I mean, it is kind of funny, but at the same time, when we have these discussions about what can we call a concentration camp, and if you've got historians and they're saying, I have bad news, you guys, you really ought to be paying attention. And I understand why some people who may have lost a lot of family members in the Holocaust, or potentially in the Gulag as well, but particularly the Roma, the Sinti, and the European Jews that faced genocide from the Nazi camps, may not want to embrace that term. I personally use it, and I think it's important for a lot of public-facing people to use it so that people understand, whatever you want to call it, the trajectory that we're on. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, I understand that some people, they would say that, it cheapens what happened to my people, right? To say that this other thing is like the same category of item. But I don't think it does cheapen it personally. And it's, as somebody who doesn't have family who's been in camps like that, I feel that it helps me to understand the weight of what like my government is currently responsible for, right? That to say like, it is this serious. We are attempting to reconstruct something that is as bad as it gets.
And it's important to also note, both in terms of observing the Holocaust and understanding where we're at. So 2 very important reasons, that what people often think of as concentration camps are actually a set of about a half dozen death camps that were established mid-war by Nazi Germany. Around 1942, there are some specific dates that they're probably not necessary to our discussion today, but mid-war. And that those were the actual camps that were meant to kill people and process those deaths as quickly as possible.
Right.
And I think that it is still a singular phenomenon, one that we don't want to repeat. But what most people don't realize is that for almost a decade before that, the Nazis had an open concentration camp system that they were running that actually allowed them to arrive at those death camps later. And so it's that earlier history. And if you discount everything before the death camps as somehow not concentration camps, then you're discounting places like Dachau, which was never
Right.
a death camp, but which I think we could all agree was very much a concentration camp. And so I try to, and I have a million examples I could give you, from Argentina to, the Balkans to Vietnam and Korea. But I tend to use things like the Gulag and the Nazi camps because those are the only ones that most people are even aware of. But it isn't that we are somehow only exactly repeating Nazi history. We could draw on threads from a lot of places, right?
Right.
But I think that since people know so little of it for a general conversation, so think Dachau, not Auschwitz, right?
Yeah.
Right.
For this particular discussion.
Right. Well, we get caught, obviously, as you just alluded to, right, in the horrifying torture and murder and the most dreadful things, right? But if we just, for a moment, take ourselves away and just look at what the word is: concentration. What are we attempting to do, right? We are attempting to bring certain groups of people into small, readily understood areas to manage them. And while
collecting and containing.
Right. And while we can look, in places like Cuba and Argentina and Germany and Russia and all over, right? Hitler was very fond of how we handled the Native Americans. He thought that was very well done, and he was inspired by that as well. So, certainly there are blemishes on our history, and we don't even have to go back to the Native Americans. We can go back to World War II too, where we had camps that we concentrated people in, to be sure.
So absolutely. And we can go back even sort of before that to say that in 1890s, the very first one I was talking about, which was a policy of reconcentración by the Spanish in Cuba, they were putting down a rebellion. And it was actually the public descriptions of and reporting from Cuba in the US that turned people, everyday Americans, so much against what the Spaniards were doing, this policy of reconcentración, in which women and children were starving to death and getting sick because they were concentrated in these really unhealthy conditions. Americans were donating food, and the train companies would carry the food like to the coasts, and ships were bringing it down to Cuba to try to save these lives, which is how the Maine, for anybody who remembers their Spanish-American War history, that's why the Maine was there. It was accompanying those ships. And it blows up in the harbor. We go to war, Spanish-American War, which the U.S. wins quite quickly. And then suddenly we have the Philippines as a colony. So within a couple years, we are then instituting concentration camps in the Philippines. And it had things like waterboarding. It had things that we have seen come up again in American detention. And so, this is a long cycle, absolutely including Japanese-American internment during World War II. So we ourselves have already done this.
And Katz did bring all that Cuban American history as well, and it does bear repeating because you just brought up how that concentration, reconcentrations, right? They inspired this adamant push by many Americans, including one Quaker gentleman whose name was Smedley Butler, who joined the war.
Talking about him.
Who joined the war because of what you just said, Andrea, right? Because he heard of this horrifying behavior from the Spanish, and he said, we have to do something here. I know I don't want to fight, but we have to protect these people. Right. Absolutely. So let's go from there. You mentioned the Japanese internment camps. Of course, the World War II internment camps, the concentration camps, the death camps, they are in very many ways famous. You had mentioned how part of your Inquisition regarded like what happened with this idea after the war, right? After the Second World War, this pervasiveness, it continues. So what can you tell us about concentration camps over, I guess, the last 80 years?
So the big sweeps of it, if you were my age, you might not need this explained, but for the younger folks, after World War II, quite soon after, the world split into a binary, right? So you had Cold War develop, and there was sort of the There were some more independent nations for sure, but in general, it became a largely bipolar world in all the good and bad senses of that. And so you had Soviet sphere of influence, U.S. sphere of influence. In the Soviet sphere of influence, you found a number of camp systems arise, and these have tended to be the largest ones in history that were on the model of the Soviet Gulag. This idea of re-education through labor, this idea of enemies of the state, right? And counter-revolutionaries, people that didn't accept the revolution, that were seen as reactionaries, that could actually be put in them. And again, it's important to emphasize that this is always being done kind of adjacent to a legal system, right? Even in those countries, there is a functioning or dysfunctioning legal system, and the camps are a separate thing from this. This is administrative detention. This is like a different kind of detention. It's always an end run. And so you have in Vietnam, you have a similar model in Korea. You see a little bit of the same with Khmer Rouge, but that was sort of an entire nation that was turned into kind of a concentration camp by its revolutionary leadership. But you see the Chinese openly modeling theirs on the Russian Gulag. And you see behind the Iron Curtain, so in Eastern Europe, a lot of similar kinds of detention. You see a little bit of it in Cuba as well. However, and people think, well, of course, that's what happened to concentration camps. But actually, the Allied side, the non-Russia allies from World War II, actually returned to that part we were talking about from the turn of the century in Spain and the Philippines. And because they themselves are then fighting a lot of independence movements. In Africa, people want to be independent and they're trying to break off from the British, from the French. And so what you see there is a return to those kind of early military style where they're trying to put down a rebellion. They cordon off different parts of the population. They clear the community out. They forcibly remove women, children, everybody. And then in those contested areas, basically whoever's left is considered a terrorist. And so this is actually the birth of, if you've ever heard, we have to destroy the village to save the village. This is actually part of that whole system of how it unfolded in Vietnam. But what you did not see, you absolutely did not see, was any of this go away. You did not have Auschwitz again, right? But the stuff that led up to Auschwitz actually proliferates tremendously around the globe. And I will say, even in the US, and I'll write about this sometime quite soon, because I think it's important for people to realize, after the Japanese-American internment ended, which, to remind everybody, if you don't know it, did principally detain US citizens. Okay, so even the idea they were enemy aliens from World War I was made worse because it was actually inflicted not just on that population, which I don't think it should have been, but also on U.S. citizens of Japanese American descent in that part of the country. And so people think, oh, well, that went away. We'll just get rid of what's happening now, right? We'll just have an election. It'll be easy to get rid of it. People don't know that after World War II, when Harry Truman was still president, Congress gave him, against his will, gave the president the power to declare a state of emergency and to detain those he deemed a threat in concentration camps. And that he begged them not to do it. He said it would be a long step toward totalitarianism to maintain camps like that. And they actually were so in favor of it, they did it over his veto. So it passed. Those camps were maintained for more than a decade. There was a plan for how you would run those camps if he declared that emergency. And it was not until Nixon, if you can believe it, that was taken off the books. So those camps, they persist. They do not go away. And the country really just dodged a bullet that was never used in the 60s protests. It was really a huge gift to the country that was not called out.
That's a lot.
Sorry.
No,
it's good. Here's something about me is I have a really tragically bad history background because I don't know, it's just like my teachers didn't care or something. But for some reason, my high school American history teacher spent like an entire school year on the Spanish-American War. Okay. Which means that there wasn't time for other things. Yeah, exactly. And so like there's so many things in history that like I hear about for the first time by being a co-host of this podcast. And it is eternally embarrassing for me, but I just have to like swallow the embarrassment and like take it like a grown up, and I'm learning now, right? Like
But you know what? I grew up in West Virginia, and my history teachers, for the most part, were football coaches. And so, I remember that everybody, I didn't, because I actually liked history, but I remember people running up to the front and like looking before the tests and looking through, because it was always the test from the textbook, right? And they would look at the answer key in the back of his book because he was out smoking and outside before he would come in, and
he's not writing his own
and they
test
would be,
questions.
and I remember one of them was like, people were shouting like, "Guns Leopold Butter," which had to be about the Congo, I think. Leopold, right? It has to be Congo. But I remember "Guns Leopold Butter." So I grew up very much with a history background like you. So I am empathetic to that and here to answer whatever questions you might have as a result of what long things I say.
Well, let's jump into that until we move forward, of course. Harry Truman, famous for people not thinking that he was going to do very well, or that he would be a very conservative president, right? That was what Jimmy Byrne of the Carolinas thought. That's what a lot of the more conservative Democrats thought when they fought for him to become the vice president nominee. Why don't you think that America did fall to use those concentration camps across the 50s or the 60s? Certainly, we had lots of how do I say, revolutionary ideas coming across during that time, and certainly there was a lot of civil unrest. Johnson and his Great Society have been credited for many things, as well as Vietnam. How do you think we avoided that pitfall that we are now maybe falling in finally?
I think that certainly McCarthyism was rampant. So there was a tremendous risk when you combine civil unrest with McCarthyism. I think that there was such a strong sense of this idea of we are a nation of laws. And again, to emphasize, the existing legal systems that camps are an end run around are often really problematic. And I would put Jim Crow laws in the U.S. as in that extremely problematic category, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
People were restricted. There was all kinds of violence. We've passed the brunt of, but there's still absolutely the threat of lynching is something that African Americans are very aware of. We have, we're not long from the Eisenhower period where there are massive purges of immigrants in that moment. And so, it isn't that we were so awesome, but I think there was a sense that we were supposed to be a nation under a law, like a law-abiding nation. Mm-hmm. And that was part of the selling point that the right would use, right? These protesters, they're unlawful, they're illegal, but absolutely like taking their rights away from them, I think would have been seen as too much. And the civil rights movement was so good at understanding the optics of what they were trying to do. And and that was a lot of suffering that they had to endure to have people understand just what was happening, like privately when nobody was looking, if this is what happened when people were looking. And I think the idea of moving against whole communities and probably honestly, white kids in colleges would have made them, the people in power, seem lawless and seem abusive in ways that they knew wouldn't be tolerated. And it's also possible that there were voices of moderation there. Harry Truman, not necessarily somebody we think of as FDR too, right? Who begged Congress to not do this in the first place with these camps, right? So I think that sometimes people will surprise you, as I think we are seeing the beginnings of some people now who might not have liked Trump, but maybe kind of didn't mind him either, but saying this is too far, right? This is too far.
Yeah.
Power
I think
revealed.
we're seeing a pattern of that idea of like there's peaks into the lawlessness and the cruelty that America gets right now. Like when we hear about a specific child that's been put in the Dilley Center in Texas, it gives people a sense of like, if I'm aware of how things progressed for like Liam Conejo Ramos, for example, with his little bunny hat, if I saw what happened to him, I can imagine how it is for all of the other families that are in that center. And I find that unacceptable, right? Like, if that's the thing that got out to the public, we can all sort of infer and extrapolate and realize that we need to do something about it.
And I think we've seen that with, I mean, and with particularly with Liam Conejo Ramos, as you said, with Alex Pretty, with Renee Good. I think that we see
people don't like it.
May be fairly extreme cases, but we also know there are a lot of people whose stories we are not hearing or seeing. Yeah. And so I do think that having those visuals, and in our propaganda saturated sort of siloed world, having those like literal viral video moments of little boy in blue cap, somebody being shot in the face, those become not just journalistic stories at that point, right? They become like, memes is the wrong word, but like iconic historical moments that creep into TikTok, creep into Instagram. Everybody has seen those three. And I think that honestly, so many people manage to live without attending to all the stuff that we talk about here and that you talk about on your shows. They just have checked out because they don't feel like they have a stake in it in any way, or it's there to punish them. And so I think some of those people are actually going to be super empathetic if they know what's going on.
The Alex Pretty, the one picture, right? The one picture where they're holding him and the gun is
he's already on the ground.
Yeah, that one is that one's going to be known forever. I mean, that is an iconic picture in the worst sense of the word. You know, in the same way
I go to protests and I see the blue hat depicted in a lot of places, Liam's hat. So yeah, there's definitely ways.
And I think too that it's, you know, it's because it shows the lawlessness of what's happening. And again, one of the things I worry about is if we undo this part of it, but we leave that the police get to do this to minority communities when nobody's looking, we keep the seeds of it coming back. And those communities still have to endure what sort of everybody is seeing now, which is it's not justice, it's not fair. But something like those three incidents makes it clear this is not about law and order. There's no way to make the argument that shooting that guy in the back, right? The nurse.
Yeah.
ICU nurse.
And that's the case the case that MAGA is trying to make, right? Which is that we are the party of law and order. We are going to relieve this society of the undesirables because they're all, you know, criminals and terrorists and whatever. And so we're going to restore law and order no matter how many laws we have to break to do it, right?
And you know what? You said that, but that is exactly with the British in what was then Burma, what's now Myanmar. And over, I mean, they did it in British Malaya. They were in a number of different places and they were doing these kinds of things. And particularly in British Malaya, there's actually a record of and I'm forgetting who it is in this moment, but a British leader of that battle, that fight. And he says, like, to keep the law, for a time, we have to break the law. It was very close to that. And it was this idea that, you know, and it's actually a big theory idea, this idea of a state of exception, right? You create a window in which to preserve the law, we're just not going to observe it for a while because we have to do this one thing. Right. And concentration camps
destroy the village to save the village, right?
But it's also, we always have to move. There is some group that has to be removed from society. Right. And so when some people ask about slavery, they say, well, isn't slavery the same as concentration camps? And it's like not a better or worse thing. I don't mean in that way at all, because chattel slavery is horrific, but it's like kind of two different modes. And the concentration camp tendency is to take groups of people outside of society and remove them. And with slavery, you're actually forcing a group into your society to exploit the labor. Labor is often a byproduct on the camp side, right? But with slavery, it is absolutely the expropriation, the taking of that labor is at the heart of it.
Well, again, you noted what power does. Power reveals as much as it corrupts, right? We see a situation in which Truman, who, as you noted, right, not considered FDR Jr., has very strong liberal notions and tendencies once he becomes president. In many ways. And the same can be said regarding Nixon in reverse, right? Here is a man who was vice president. He was a representative, served in other capacities as well. And the amount of power that he got turned him into a psychopath, even more than he already was.
Yeah. So I just think that, you know, Nixon is a good example of one kind of way that some of this happens, in that he believed that he himself was above the law. In the end, he came to believe that he was so critical for the country that that it was sort of his own God complex for himself, right? But he had none of the charisma. I mean, he got elected twice, which is kind of extraordinary in retrospect. But there was no cult of Nixon the way we have a mega cult today. There were hardcore diehards for sure. But there's a certain number of people in any society, somewhere around 25%, we don't know exactly, but we can ballpark it around there, that are reactionary, that like authoritarianism, that want this, right? So Nixon was always going to have them. Trump is always going to have them. Right. But this weird cult of personality that has developed, I think is something that, strangely enough, whether it was because of his charisma levels or because he had other people in his administration, that when he would start doing the drunk uncle stuff, literal drinking, drunk uncle stuff, that Trump does all the time without drinking, as Trump had in his first administration, more of, there were people who would shut that stuff down. And eventually, when Watergate happened, there were enough elected Republicans, particularly with the 18-minute gap in the tape, and that appeared to have been erased by his secretary and all this stuff once they found the tapes that Nixon had. Right. The Republicans, there were some who said, enough, like, I won't do this. And those guys are gone right now, from the House and the Senate. Massey is the only one we're seeing that's sort of carrying on in a consistent way. We do see with the Epstein files, Mace and Boebert, it's interesting to see some of the fissures that are developing. But right now we haven't seen, outside of maybe Massey, who I disagree with on many things, but we are seeing what appears to be an actual principled stand against some part of this, right? But we do not see the people who believe in this idea of America that are saying, enough, we're going to stop this, that we did see at Watergate. And that's one of the big hurdles that we have to figure out how between now and next January, when potentially, a blue wave may have brought some other people in, what is the immediate way we can deal with it, which is a challenge. I know we're going to talk at some point a little bit about what to do, but.
We are. Nixon is an interesting one because certainly he has very many horrible tendencies and questionable ideas. But, if you read what Pat Buchanan thought of Nixon, having worked for him during that time, right? Buchanan he's not sold on Nixon's conservative credentials. He's like, I've never met a man who believed in nothing. Right? I've never, and that's Pat Buchanan saying that about Richard Nixon, right? Somebody we consider to be very
it feels like we're swimming in people who believe in nothing right now, in this administration.
We've come into a real nihilism, but what Nixon, I think Nixon, this is hypothetical on my part, sure. I will admit, I'm a little out of my lane here, but I don't think Nixon would have embraced the inanity of MAGA, even if it delivered him the MAGA stuff. He had a certain intellectual pride in himself, an arrogance, that I think you have to surrender. Look at Ted Cruz, look at Marco Rubio, look at Lindsey Graham, who have said, who started out in 2016 knowing exactly what was going on and now have bought in, right? I don't think, not because he was a good person, that Nixon wouldn't have done it. I think Nixon could not have brought himself to humiliate his intellect so thoroughly. He had too much pride, I guess I would say, for that.
I used to think that JD Vance being the vice president, when he was named as the running mate, I was kind of surprised because I was like, I remember him saying, I'm a never Trump guy. That guy's almost Hitler, basically, he's an aspiring fascist. I don't like him, and then it took me a little while to realize that the reason why he was so attractive to Trump as a vice presidential nominee might actually be how completely he brought him to heel, right? To be like, this guy is somebody who truly you can make him reverse course on any principled stance he ever thinks he's taken if he thinks he's going to get something from you. So that's a pawn, really. That's a good pawn. That's what you want on your
Trump would not be able to have a rival in that position. I don't think it's just anybody that he could see, even as keeping him from a third term, because in his mind he is thinking about that. I don't know how heavily he's thinking about it, but we have seen him thinking about it. So having anybody that might even be a threat to that, would be too much. And so
he's got Trump 2028 merch, for goodness sake.
Anybody who thinks that the president is just going to pack up shop and leave in 2028 has not been paying attention over the last 10 plus years. He intends to be carried
out of the White House.
I don't care if it's unpopular. I don't care if it's unpopular to say. Trump is not going to leave voluntarily. We're going to have to tell him to get out.
I actually, that part I absolutely agree with. I think he might leave voluntarily, but it is up to us, the people, to make that inevitable, to make it, whether it's out on the streets, whether it is electing people who will stand against him in a more serious way than some Democrats are at this moment, although some are doing quite well with it. I think that he is a coward ultimately. And if it is made clear to him that he will not be allowed to say, but this is a little bit like, I think of, Mitt Romney now gets all this credit for sort of calling Russia the big threat, right? I don't want to give him that credit because the truth is, since Putin has been around, they have always been knocking, right?
Yeah.
Trump was the only one that opened the door. And it was only by opening the door that all this bad stuff that's related to that. And I'm not somebody who's like, Russia is everything, but Russia is bad. And he is the only person that has opened that door that way. And in the same way, I think that there are lots of people that would like to have power that don't, but if that possibility is not there, if you don't indulge it, as the Republicans should never, like like we talked about the Cruzes and, the Lindsey Grahams, they never should have indulged any of this. And I think as soon as you shut that down, like Trumpism becomes a much, much tinier force. Now, then we still have to resolve the camps. We still have to resolve fascism. There's going to be a lot left to resolve, but J.D. Vance is not going to be the inheritor of Trumpism. Right?
No,
it's not.
No.
Wet beanbag.
He doesn't have the personality. And this gets into another discussion that we might have to have you back for, right? How the cult of personality, how the cult of leadership acquires its individual. It's not simply like passed down from person to person. The person that takes over from the great leader is usually not revered. He's not, covered in this cloth of mysticism. And he doesn't get that same respect. In many cases.
One example in the world where that has happened, because I think it's instructive as the exception. Although, first, as a little caveat, the U.S. very much has those tendencies, which I think we have to be careful for. If you look at the Kennedys, if you look at the Clintons, if you look at the Bushes, so you have to say it's something. Humanity, you have to watch out for that because it is a tendency that we have with the familiar and the known. But I think it's much more a function of propaganda. And it only can work really effectively when you have year after year or even generation after generation control of all the information that people are getting. And the only example that we have of that is
North Korea.
And so if you, and I believe this could happen in any country, if you had that kind of control and if you could douse people in propaganda morning, noon, and night for decades, then everybody is susceptible to that. But just that kind of control over the information sphere, particularly in this era, is really hard to do. And so that's why we don't see the ability to create family heirs that have that kind of power.
I see MAGA Twitter accounts that will be like, okay, so we've got Trump 2024. We'll have Donald Trump Jr. 2028 and 2032. And then it'll be like Ivanka and then like Barron. And like, it's always met with just derision because everyone's like, you already lost us at Donald Trump Jr. Like, that's not happening.
And it's true. And I think it's because that he was this character. He is still, hopefully not for much longer, but Donald Trump Sr. is an invention of the American psyche, right? He is, and yes, he's been racist since before he was famous. So who he is not just a result of that, but where he is absolutely a result of where you could have the Central Park 5 debacle happen in the first
Right.
place. It is where you have infotainment as the primary news source. He is a creation of American culture from my lifetime. He is like, if you could manifest every single ugly part of pop culture and each president before him in my lifetime, Donald Trump, the worst, literally, if you picked out the worst couple elements from each, he's just a ball of that. And so I would say that unless he has a kid, unless Barron magically is somehow that creation, which is impossible. Like, you can't pass that particular kind of cult of personality because it's a cultural creation.
And I totally agree. I think that the North Korea situation is a little bit different because, as you said, of the grip that they have, but also there is hardly a choice. In America, there are still choices. And I think that while you can go online and you can see people being like, like Donald Trump Jr., like 28, 32, right? Like, you are not walking down the street and seeing like people excited about Donald Trump Jr., excited about anyone other than Donald Trump. You can't even get many of these folks, right? Statistically speaking, you can't even get them to come out and vote for your side if Donald Trump isn't there, right? So I don't know if we get sold as a people on our leaders in the same way.
No, we can't, because again, I think simply because there's just not that kind of control to do that kind of propaganda. Yeah. There's only a handful of times in history where it's even been possible to do that. And nobody's been able to do it for so many years to where people don't even know what the alternative in many cases could possibly, whereas in the US, there's always been that. And this is one of the things that I emphasize with where we're at now is that it's going to take quite a bit to undo it because, the camps have been kind of burbling along this threat, certainly at least in huge ways since the War on Terror, with the detention we did at Guantanamo, which was originally an immigrant detention facility, and that you had thousands of Cubans and Haitians detained there under terrible conditions where courts were intervening. And it was the courts, for a lot of reasons I won't all the way go into today because it's a long story, but a deliberate choice to free some people that were in particularly bad conditions there in exchange for a judge for it not going on the law record, the case sort of being vacated. So that allowing the courts to have jurisdiction there would not become a permanent feature of Guantanamo. That set up in those immigration detention days what happened with the War on Terror. So the U.S. has continuously operated that, right? So now we're in year 24. 24th anniversary was in January of War on Terror detention there. That combined with what Trump was trying to do in the first administration with the border detention. And keep in mind that border detention was very publicly different in terms of trying to look cruel, separating the families, having people crowded into cages that then you allowed to be photographed like animals, right? Yeah. There was a spectacle that he was trying to do of intimidation and fear. But a lot of the elements of that you saw were pre-existing in the immigration detention system, right? He had tools when he came in that he could use this particular way. And so I'd say our current camps are a fusion of sort of that Gitmo history and that border detention history that all you need is somebody like a Trump to spark it into something quite much bigger.
So with that being said, Andrea, it's like you knew which direction we were headed in, right? We got through the 60s and talked a little bit about Nixon. We won't spend much time on Ronald Reagan because we don't want to. But we should recommence sort of where you just got to, right? The early 2000s, the War on Terror, post 9/11 America. Can you give us, I mean, you just did in so many ways, but can you give us perhaps a bit different, a speed run of what that allowed for us, whether it's practically speaking or intellectually speaking? How did this set the stage for where we are now? And then we'll talk about all that.
Well, I think you saw black sites, right, around the world. So we saw these places that we sent people to. We were actually corrupting our allies by having them do extra legal things. Once again, we have this end run around what's really legal, by hosting these black sites where people could be tortured, where they could be held. And we had things like Abu Ghraib, which wasn't actually a prison, but where a lot of people were detained because it was suspected there was a problem, but we didn't know who they were yet. We were finding out. So even sort of the legal prison systems that you sometimes have in a wartime, in a war setting, were bastardized. And I've talked to people who did detentions in those settings, in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And it was a shit show. It was totally random. And, Gitmo became an outgrowth of that. And then the famous imperial boomerang theory of things that we do abroad in colonialism tend to be brought back into the heart of whatever sort of the imperial country. You do see a related phenomenon in which I think we see those things work their way. Literally, prisoners are brought from some of those black sites, like to Gitmo, as the courts start to assert more power about sort of what the U.S. is doing. So we see it Gitmo, and then we see it being injected like into our society now in a number of ways. But during that time frame, so again, we corrupted those allies by having them do that. And in some cases, they've had to pay restitution. In some cases, they got in trouble in Europe with because this was in violation of law. And then we fast forward to last year. If you remember in the spring, Trump sent mostly Venezuelans to CICOT, right, under Bukele. Mm-hmm. And so we are basically paying millions to support a place that people are sent to, often without due process, and never leave. So we are helping to support a concentration camp type setting there. We're actually deporting people to it. We are meanwhile now sending people to many, many other countries. Just last week, we heard about Cameroon and what's happening there. It's my belief that we are actually institutionalizing that informal black site network that we had at the beginning of the war on terror 20, 25 years ago. We're actually like paying money, making contracts with these countries. We are destabilizing democracy around the world by creating a network of black site detentions that looks very much like concentration camps. And we are associating it with detention, which is expanding exponentially, like inside the US today. And so certainly having those forerunners, certainly having those forerunners has an effect. It isn't that I think your average ICE thug on the street who is itching to, mess with somebody or even shoot them is thinking about, I'm, wondering, what did we do in 2007 at that black site? But this is the thing about systems, right? You don't have to do that. If these things become endemic in the system, if you bring all that military equipment back home to your small towns, and suddenly they're like SWAT teams instead of your local beat cop who sometimes had issues to start with, right? Like, let's not kid ourselves. But turning that into militarized armor is not the answer. And then creating where you have camps holding up to 10,000 people, and the plans they've been putting out, camps that will hold up to 10,000 people in multiple locations around the US, that they are even now with some of this resistance that's happening to trying to buy these warehouses using a Navy contract, using Navy expeditionary contracts, which expeditionary contracts is what built the courtroom that I visited in 2015 at Guantanamo, right? So you just see how it becomes a systemic answer because there's somebody in charge who is saying, how do we solve this problem? And those people, the planning people, the logistics people say, hey, you know what? I know how we could do this. And so then the system has an answer, even without like the individual guy on the street needing to say, let's make a bunch of concentration camps, right? I think Stephen Miller is probably actually saying, let's make a bunch of concentration camps. But I think there's a whole bunch of people that work for the government that don't even realize the role they're playing in this moment and then where it can go.
Yeah. I think he says it in his mirror every morning. I would like to make concentration camps. Yeah. It's part of his daily affirmations.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're 100% right, Andrea. I think that for many people, obviously we remember the famous Nazi line, right? Only following orders. But for many people, we are just thinking about getting our job done today, getting food, going home, seeing the children, and this is not an excuse. So, to be sure,
Yeah.
but this is the way that we often see life play out, society play out. I'll quote an likely apocryphal Woodrow Wilson quote, because there's hardly any evidence that he said it. Once you lead the people into war, they will forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. The spirit of ruthless brutality will enter every fiber of our national life, infecting Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the streets. And that's what I thought about as you were just explaining.
Like the temperature of the air, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was thinking about that ICE officer in Portland whose audio was recently released, where he had like literally a young person on a motorized bicycle that was tailing him. And in the audio, he's calling the police, like the Oregon Police Bureau, I think, or the maybe Portland Police. And he's calling them and he's like, I need you to deal with this kid who's following me on the bicycle because I'm about to have to shoot him, I think. And it's like literally just a kid on a bike who's doing ice watch, who's like following, but not impeding, not threatening, not anything, just on a bike. And the way that it felt like he was thinking was like, I don't want to be followed and observed because that sucks and makes me uncomfortable and might get me in trouble. And what do I have at my disposal to deal with this short-term goal that I have, which is like losing this freaking kid? And it's going to be violence because I have a bunch of violent weapons at my disposal and I don't really have qualms about it. And, my ultimate goal is just like, no more kid, please. And
well,
so
again,
that's what we end up with.
It's the policeman on the beat, as you just alluded to. We can look at Trayvon Martin and we can say it's the man in the street as well, right? You create this environment, as you noted, this pressure cooker of there's violence everywhere. There are invaders everywhere. Everyone is trying to attack me. Everyone is against us. And it breeds these sort of
decades of slander against them too, of like, well, I'm looking at this guy and I just think he's got to be a terrorist or a criminal or a murderer or something because look at him, right? And
I'm so glad you said that because like that, I think goes back to what I was saying before. And it's so important for everybody to hear on in your listening audience, but everywhere that you don't get to that without generations of targeting like particular groups. Right. You can't. But the good news is also that like that propaganda has to be sustained. And so if you just only had propaganda, that guy shoots the kid. He doesn't even call. Yeah. He knows he can't he knows it's probably not a good idea just to shoot the kid, right? He wants to shoot the kid. Right. No, and I don't mean to minimize it, but that's really good that he doesn't think he has the ability to shoot the kid in that moment. And if you have enough propaganda for long enough, everybody would accept, of course he shot the kid. The kid was a terrorist,
he had to.
But he's in this, we're in this in-between state. And so absolutely building that counter narrative. And I don't think we resort to untrue propaganda like for it, but we should absolutely resort to viral memes and to TikToks and to like all this stuff to get out this idea of what a snowflake. Oh my God, the kid is following me on a bike. No, you don't get to shoot the kid. Like that's not an option. That's horrible. And you're a bad person if you do that. And you know what? You're a bad person if you go to work for ICE. You shouldn't work for ICE. That's a shameful thing. Right. And you don't get your kids and tell your kids if they're thinking about taking jobs, don't take jobs with ICE. And so, so much of it is to create this, we have to create our own information atmosphere, whether it's through creating news institutions, which I think we're sorely lacking in, ones that aren't even accidentally bound up in power structures that, replicate some of this. As I would say, the New York Times still has a tremendous amount of great reporting, but it is also tremendously bound up in having a certain relationship to power. And it even with the goodwill of people inside it, it is very difficult. And some people don't have goodwill, but most of them do. It's very difficult to escape that historical relationship. And so we have to rethink what are news outlets, what can they look like, what can they be? But we also have to everyday people have to create this in our own communities through the things that we do, right?
And we're starting to see, I've long described it as, the forest, we got some big trees that are starting to fall. Andrea. We got some big trees that are starting to fall. The branches of the canopy are starting to detach and fall away, and light is shining through. And you're seeing lots of smaller publications developing and serving, as you sort of just alluded to, right? Serving the proper position, which is to be fighting for the people, right? Explaining information to the people, fighting power.
Also long-standing local news organizations, that they're like traditional in that sense, but they're smaller and more local. And whenever something happens in their area, they get a bunch of attention that they richly deserve because they're doing good reporting.
Yeah, there's all kinds of great stuff that is happening. I mean, I see some things like traditional outlets that now have shifted ownership, like Philly Inquirer is doing great stuff, right? So there's an old stalwart that has transformed itself and is kind of in this new medium. We have seen Marissa Cabas from The Handbasket. I'm sure we all read her stuff regularly, who is just a champion, like in amazing ways. We see LA Taco. That's like a taco review thing, right? And they have become this amazing news source. But we also see a lot of people more in the style of Marissa who, this on the ground, the 19th I'm thinking of. I mean, there's just so many different groups around the country that are rising up. One thing I think we have to keep in mind is the risk, though, with what we've seen with the way the Washington Post has collapsed, with what we've seen with the LA Times collapse, with what we saw in terms of Peter Thiel appearing to be instrumental in Gawker's demise. We need some of those big trees to have the ecosystem last, because the ability to fight the government, if the DOJ comes after you in a legal battle and you are like a small independent news org, is really tough. And so I would love to see, I am trying to give up on the wishful thinking of billionaire funding stuff, because that's so pernicious and it never seems to work the way that it ought to. Right. And so I would love to see an investor take a chance and actually, not just as a philanthropist, but as a news enterprise, come up with like local newsrooms that then could be like an AP feed to each other, that hopefully wouldn't destroy the actual AP itself, which still does some good work. So I do think that we need to have some fireproof news orgs that will not cave, because they don't have a choice if DOJ goes after them. But at the same time, I do think that we absolutely need this ecosystem that is arising. So even the stuff you guys are doing, is a part of that.
Well,
we're part of the solution.
We're
true. Actually heroes. Trent,
shout out to Marissa. That's another friend of the program right there.
We do love Marissa very much.
We've got many friends of the program, and they all come on to talk. Well, Andrea Pitzer, you are one of them. Would you know, we're not done yet, because we have spent the whole discussion getting to today. And today we have concentration camps, and we have pernicious and nefarious individuals who are looking to purchase warehouses, looking to develop these camps all around the country. We spoke about it quickly with Katz. What's the deal, Andrea?
What's the deal with
concentration camps?
That's going to be the name of this episode.
What's the deal with concentration camps? So where we are now is that, a while ago, Stephen Miller is said to have imposed this 3,000 arrests a day quota. They deported about 400,000 people last year. It's not markedly different than what the prior administrations have been able to do. They just are making it noisier and more violent and more public spectacle. Their limits are a little bit right now on hiring. They need a lot more officers, both to run the system they're talking about for deportation, but also what the system is kind of evolving into, which is this law enforcement agency that has loyalty to the president, which is something that you tend to see in concentration camp settings. Secret police that takes people off the street, that answers only to the party in power. That's good for us that they're having trouble hiring. That's another reason to make it super, super shameful. The downside is that they are skimping on all this training. And so I think people are more trigger happy. They're more ignorant. But as I have been saying for a while now, the answer to DACA is not better training for the guards, right? So I don't think that buy-in and of itself is going to somehow fix the problem. Although I do think that having that lack of training is a significant problem. Where they're having a lot more success with some setbacks for right now is expanding detention beds. And they have big goals on that. Right now, they have about 70,000 people in detention. When they first started this warehousing initiative, which has been kind of coming out over the last couple months, the warehousing initiative, the goal was to have 80,000 more people in detention. And so some of those have been getting interrupted, which is kind of amazing because the federal government does have the ability to seize land and infrastructure in some cases, particularly where it can be related in some way to national security. And courts tend to give the executive a lot of leeway on this. And there's no reason to think our current court wouldn't be likely to do that as well. Yet we see lots of people pushing back on this warehouseification by, in some cases in Republican areas, by doing the kind of not in my backyard, and they make it so unpleasant. And in some cases, there was a quote, I'm sure you saw it, from the woman who was saying, well, I support President Trump for this, but I don't want my kids to have to see it. I don't want the kids that I work with for my job to have to see it. I don't want them escapees, or, I don't want them to have to deal with this. And I think it's fine to lean into that, because in those cases, people who have Republican U.S. senators, who have Republican U.S. governors, those people with a call to the administration can kind of undo it, right? Yeah. And they can stop it. But I do think you're going to see some of those go through. Other people are looking at infrastructure and zoning laws. There's a great Urban Institute report out that you might include a clip to when you post this episode, because the new report talks about what's legal and what's not. If you just pass ordinances that are not letting ICE do these things, the courts will not uphold them. And so how you frame what you are doing as a city or a town or a community, if you want to use those kinds of laws, is extremely important. And so I see people doing really creative things about making choices about what kind of community they want to live in on a broader way, which I think is great. We do see, however, with this Navy contract that they're pushing through, there may be other ways to not necessarily take warehouses, but to start standing up camps with a lot of money available in an expedited fashion. And so I think that's what's coming down the pike, and we're going to have to develop a new set of creative tools to handle that. But the thing that I have found, first of all, I am inspired and in awe of the millions of ways that Americans have been responding to this. Yep. Creative. The Portland Frog is genius. I don't care if people sometimes make fun of what does that do? It does a lot, right? But we also have these concrete things of these lawyers that are representing Kilmar Abrego Garcia and Liam Conejo Ramos that are doing incredible work. And across the 130 years of camps that I looked at for my book, the things that made a difference in terms of undoing the camps quickly typically are to have at least a semi-functioning judiciary and to have the ability and willingness to have public dissent. Those two things, if you can protest and if you have a partially functioning court system, then it is possible. And we are freer right now. Most Americans are freer to push back than any of the places that I studied where camps had come this far along. And I think it's a particular sign of our heritage, right? We have two American heritages. One is nested in Native American genocide and chattel slavery and, all of the terrible things. Yep. But the other one is also this amazing history of resistance right from the beginning to injustice. And so I don't think anybody that claims only one of those as American is being accurate. But I do think we can choose, right? We can choose which one we want.
We got two wolves. You heard it here first, guys. Got two wolves inside of us.
Not the two wolves, Trent. Come on, man.
It's not a polar bear. You got two polar bears inside you, right?
Yeah. Cool.
Don't shoot the bear. That's the other
Don't shoot the bear, even though we got Andrea. Don't shoot the bear. Andrea, well, thank you for that. We know we have to let you go sooner than later, and well, I'll spill the beans. Caitlin and I hate that. We don't want you to go, but we know you've got to. We would like to end our wonderful chat on a positive note. on how we gonna defeat the fascists, how are we going to save our neighbors, our comrades, our Americans, our human beings.
I mean, that was just pretty encouraging just there, right? Like we have avenues. We can do it.
We absolutely have avenues. And so one thing I will say is don't let me hold you back, because there is no single received answer. There's no one weird trick. Okay. Concentration camps. That's not the way it works. And
Right.
you don't have this stuff rise up without a lot being wrong in the society. So it's going to have to happen on a national level, but it's also going to have to happen on a local level. And one of the absolute best things you can do is literally like walk out your front door, go to a demonstration, or just connect yourself in some way to an existing organization. If you aren't a person who, if you're nervous in public, you're agoraphobic, you have a small kid, whatever, you can make a phone call, you can email somebody, tie yourself into some group, because you don't even know what you can do until you're talking to people who are doing stuff. But literally diaper banks in your hometown are part of the answer, right? Us being more connected where we are locally has a huge effect. There was a thing about Black Lives Matter, a study done about the Black Lives Matter protests, and it turns out they actually helped swing the election to Biden. And do you know where they made the most difference? They made the most difference in rural, less educated, and whiter parts of the country. And this is just my theory, because I'm not a political scientist, but I believe in those places that the people who saw those demonstrations were either tuned out politically or in a right-wing silo in terms of information. And just seeing that made them go, wait, maybe like, is there some part of this that I'm not getting? Because those people look normal, right? Like this is a normal, I know that person. And so doing stuff in your community nearby, whether it's public or whether it's just privately, getting a 3D printer and making whistles, there's a million things people are doing. That's critical. But also, I think that federal level, in the end, we need to elect people that are going to help claw back this stuff. We need to have Democrats pushing hard against Republicans that aren't sounding like Republican light, because if we just go with Republican light, then what we're going to end up with is nicer camps, right? Yeah. And there's not a Goldilocks level of camps that should be okay, right? It should be we should not have detention at the heart of our immigration system. Absolutely. And we have the means to do that at the federal level, and we have the means to do it close to home by fighting the expansion of these things. And I truly think that we can do it.
Bertram Gross's Friendly Fascism is an important read for anybody who's listening who would like to pick that up. As he famously noted, Ronald Reagan must be the nicest fascist in the world, right? But still a fascist all the same. Andrea, you are supreme. We will have you back if you can find more time for us. Before we let you go, will you brag about all the places that people can read your stuff, find your books, hear you talk, hear your rant, other than right here with us? Give us all the tea, please.
Well, God forbid you want more. But if you do, I am at AndreaPitzer.com is my website, which will link you up to everything. So that includes my books, and it includes a link to my newsletter, which is called Degenerate Art, which is a Nazi era reference if you want to look it up. And it also includes a link to my podcast, which is Next Comes What, which is also on YouTube and Spotify, as everybody's is. But and there are also links to my many articles that I've been writing about all this stuff. So if you go to AndreaPitzer.com, or you find me on Blue Sky at Andrea Pitzer, one word, you will have a bounty of as much as you could possibly want.
And one more thing. I mean, Andrea gave us so many wonderful tidbits regarding how we can make a better positive impact, how we can be the change that we seek. But you've heard this host of the program go on about it for episodes upon episodes. Hold the door. Look at somebody and smile at them. You can even compliment them on how beautiful it is today, how beautiful life can be, right? We have to be human. Don't go to the self-checkout. Say hi to the little old lady who's doing the groceries and talk. Be human. That's how we remain human.
Listen, Trent, you can take my curbside grocery pickup out of my cold, dead hands. It is not happening.
You still talk to somebody.
It's true. I do. I talk to the nice guy out of the window and I say, Caitlin Green, And then he says, I'll get you loaded up. And I say, thank you. So there is that.
Once they start replacing them folks with robots, that's when you'll hear me on you about.
That's when I start growing my own vegetables. Finally, it's gonna.
Well,
happen.
hey, you know what? I think that's a really great point, because I do think that like the separation of all of us is a huge part of that. It's a huge part of fascism. Yeah. And I am a kind of a misanthrope myself. And so you know that it's a serious thing if I'm saying that to be out and actually connected with your neighbors is critical in this moment. Right. And I personally, just to walk the walk, have been all the people that I should have been inviting, like to have dinner with and to meet with. And I have actively been doing that for the last 4 months, even though I do not have time to do it, because no, I'm serious, because I honestly think that, that is a piece of the answer. So do your curbside groceries, but learn your guy's name, right? Learn your guy's name.
Yeah.
Hey,
I love him very much. He's very nice.
We don't even have to go any further than that. You heard it from Andrea. You gotta know.
I won't dox him now, but I do know my curbside delivery.
Awesome. See, you're already you're totally best friends with him. Yeah.
Well, you know that understanding a question is half of an answer. Andrea just said it in another way just a moment ago. And until we do this thing all over again, well, this has been Half the Answer with your co-hosts Trent R. Nelson and Caitlin M. Green, and we will catch you all real soon.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.